Good morning, folks, and welcome. My name is Steve Wexler. I'm the founder and principal of Data Revelations, and I'm delighted to have five people joining me today that I like and admire a great deal. Nick Dabra, Brent Dykes, Sarah Bartlett, Andy Krackov, and Amanda Makulec. We were planning to debate the Oxford comma, but discovered that we were all in agreement about it, and so instead we decided to discuss terms and confusion around dashboards and storytelling and data visualization. This came about, well, let me show you the catalyst for this, and then, or one of the catalysts for this. So, Amanda, if you wouldn't mind sharing my screen with folks, and let me show you what article that Andy, who is the president of Hillcrest Advisory, a data communications consultancy, published this a month ago. Dashboards are not data stories. And we're going to hear from Andy in a minute. But another catalyst for this was this article that appeared from Narrative Science. When we say no more dashboards, what do we mean? And the short answer is we mean no more dashboards. Look at this. Why don't dashboards work? Um, and the stuff by Gartner. And Gartner has written about this formula extensively. And there's a fabulous book by Brent Dykes called Effective Data Storytelling. By the way, it is a fabulous book. We can stop sharing that now. I'll hold this up so people can hear it. There we go. In any case, I'm wondering if this article may have impacted the sales of the big book of dashboards. In any case, when Andy's article first appeared, I was chatting with Andy and Amanda on the Data Visualization Society Slack channel. And in fact, it is the Data Visualization Society that is hosting us today. Thank you so much. And if you're not a member, you should join. And I posited to Amanda, there are a bunch of people who I really like in this area. I'd like to hear what their thoughts are about this. In any case, so I'm going to pick on Brent first. Brent Dykes is the founder and chief data storyteller at AnalyticsHero. And Brent, do you think we need dashboards? I mean, or is that something passe? Is there a use for them? So I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people think, Brent's focused on data storytelling, data stories, and data stories replace dashboards. And I would actually argue, no, they don't. They don't. There is still a role, there still is a place for dashboards. And I recently, I've been thinking about this a long time because I actually worked for a company that focuses on dashboards, Domo. And as I focused on writing my book, Data Storytelling, I noticed there was distinct differences between what a data story is and what its purpose is compared to a dashboard. And so if you share my screen here, I have an article that I published actually just yesterday, so it's fresh, but it basically covers some of the key things that I cover. And in this, I talk about the insight funnel. And so basically, I view, we have all this raw data that we have in our business. And what does a dashboard do? What do reports do? Well, it makes it accessible to more people. It basically takes that raw data and then summarizes it. We isolate in on the key metrics, the dimensions that really matter to the audience we're sharing that dashboard with. And in my mind, that starts to, I call it story framing. We're starting to frame a story. Now, we're not necessarily telling a story. And that's the key difference there, that, at this point, we don't know what the story is. We don't know what kinds of things will come out of this data. I mean, obviously, we're focusing on data that's important to the business that we're monitoring on a regular basis. And when we make an observation and then we start to analyze it and dig into what's causing that spike in a metric or a decrease in a metric, all of a sudden, and as we get into what is causing that, maybe we find out that we've got a spike in sales on our e-commerce website, and that's directly attributed to our competitor having a product recall. And now all of their customers are now looking for a replacement, and now that's causing this spike in sales. So now we have this insight that we've learned that there's this product recall going on with our competitor. And now we need to communicate that to our marketing team. We may need to communicate that to our sales team to then take action on it. And when we're explaining an insight to others, when we need others to be involved or support an insight and make a decision, that's where a data story comes in. So I view them as kind of, they work collaboratively, they complement each other, and they're at different stages in this process. And so that's kind of how I view dashboards and data stories. I don't believe that that they are conflicting with each other. They just serve different purposes.
And folks, you can go to effectivedatastorytelling.com and see the post on this, as I think I like Brent's writing a great deal. And I'm happy to hear you saying that, hey, this may fuel the story, or this may help you find where the story is. By the way, it's interesting to note that Tableau/Salesforce have purchased the company Narrative Science, and we'll see what may be behind that that's coming. Well, in any case, it sounds like you're saying, oh no, these things aren't, one doesn't replace the other, one might fuel one of them. But Nick, you have written famously, and Nick Desbarats is independent educator and is a consultant at Practical Reporting, and has kind of taken over the workshops that Stephen Few used to give. And I've really enjoyed Nick's presentations and seeing him live and seeing the recordings, and find that wonderful, intelligent thoughts on this and think deeply about it. But you have written famously, most dashboards fail. I joked about the serial comma. You used a serial period in that. You really wanted to stop at most things. Now, if you have said most dashboards fail, why do we want to have dashboards?
Yeah. So actually, if Amanda can share my screen, I mean, obviously that was kind of a clickbaity sort of title, but the idea basically that I was trying to communicate is that, well, in my experience anyways, or certainly in kind of the organizations that I work with, the number one reason, not the only reason, but the number one reason why people ask for dashboards is typically because they just want to know, like, essentially, is everything okay? And is there anything that requires my attention? And very, very few dashboards do that effectively, right? Most rely on essentially, for example, people having very detailed background knowledge of all the numbers that they're seeing, which is kind of rarely the case, right? Or they have to click on lots of filters just to drill down into all the regions and that kind of thing. And so, I'm not saying it's easy to do that, but, when dashboards fail to do that, they generally, or often don't get used. The other kind of point that, I often talk about is, the definition, of course, of the word dashboard. As Steve mentioned, I have worked with Stephen Few in the past. I actually have a bit of a different definition than Stephen Few. I tend to go with the definition that, most people, I think, use, which is pretty much any display with a bunch of charts on it. Most people call that a dashboard, I mean, for better or for worse. And I think that in general conversation, those work just fine. But as dashboard designers, this is, I think, what's caused a lot of the confusion around, like, do we need dashboards or not? Because people are talking about so many different things when they say that word, right? Dashboard. And so one of the things that I propose, in fact, in a talk that Steve Wexler saw in a Tableau conference in 2019, is this idea that I think as designers, we need to segment this term more, right? And so in the course that I teach and the book that I'm writing, I actually have 8 different kinds of dashboards. And some of them, like the ones on the right here, these static data dashboards, I think this is where the storytelling comes in. A lot of stuff that Brent writes brilliantly about, I think really comes into play on sort of this side of things, right? Where we have essentially kind of, a packaged set of data. We found an insight, a conclusion, or we're trying to persuade somebody of something or explain something to somebody. And, that's great. Storytelling has a real role there, but there's also this whole other area, right? And so this is kind of typically where I operate, is in status monitoring. And yeah, like in that case, you can't really talk about storytelling because every time the user looks at the dashboard, the story is different. And so, the dashboard has to be designed very, very differently than if you have this sort of a static snapshot of data and that you're saying something specific about it. And so, I think that most dashboards fail. When I say that, really what I mean is most status monitoring dashboards fail. But there are other types of dashboards, like these persuasion dashboards or explanation or engagement dashboards, which actually are often quite successful, right? That makes sense.
Well, it does make sense, and you're reminding me of the massive rabbit hole I went down with Jeffrey Schaefer and Andy Cotgreave in writing the Big Book of Dashboards when we were trying to come up with what is our definition of a dashboard. If you look at the Slack channel, most of it, the largest discussion was definition of a dashboard. And finally, we just decided, well, a dashboard is a thing, and moved on from there. No, we have our particular definition of a dashboard. Since it's very brief, it's a display of data used to monitor conditions and or facilitate understanding. But we went down do we have to explain what an exploratory dashboard is versus an explanatory, static versus dynamic, multi-screen versus single screen, etc. And we decided, no, we're going to keep it broad. But as you've pointed out, well, this can cause a problem because you may not be effectively managing your audience's expectation. And that was the big takeaway, Nick, that I got from that presentation. Sarah, I'm wondering if you can pipe in on this because you've worked with a lot of different organizations. Sarah Bartlett is currently the data visualization enablement consultant at Red Hat, but also was at Slalom Consulting for a number of years. And what are you finding with this and confusion around these things and concerns about them?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll echo a lot of what Nick just said. I think so often leaders or managers will request dashboards because they don't actually necessarily need a dashboard, but they request one because that's their kind of go-to kind of term. So then the analysts will go away and perhaps build a dashboard, but they may not necessarily ask the leaders exactly what they want or what action they want to take once they have this dashboard in their hands. So as a result, there's this disconnect where the leaders are presented with a dashboard that doesn't really meet the needs or doesn't really meet the requirements that they had and therefore doesn't get used. And I think ultimately, so often dashboards lack that narrative and context that we need to be able to tell stories. So dashboards are essentially like a collection of charts, but they don't, so often they lack that the additional context and that narrative that explains exactly what's happened and why. So often they just show the what and not so much why, what's happening and exactly what we need to do about it and what we need to do to maybe improve things or fix things. And I think often the analysts, often the analysts aren't really empowered to build anything other than a dashboard too. I think with the kind of tools that we're exposed to, dashboard building has become so easy that we just build dashboards for every request now, where perhaps other forms of communication, maybe reports or infographics or other things like that may be more effective. But we're so inclined to use the tools that we're paying for that we build dashboards.
Well, Sarah, you said something, and I want to drill down on this, to use a dashboard term. Do the people who are making the dashboard understand the needs and requirements and what's wanted by their audience? Are they talking to each other, or is no, we're just making this stuff?
Often not. No, so they don't. I don't think they question enough the request and exactly what is required and why. And that's something I try and teach through my work, is how to gather dashboard requirements and speak to your stakeholders and understand their needs. Because I feel so often somebody will request a dashboard, they'll say the data source that they want, and then those analysts will go away and build something without really asking why or how it's going to be used or in what context it's going to be used. And as a result, it fails.
So there's a wonderful book, Say It with Charts, and a wonderful McKinsey consultant whose name is escaping me. I'm going to look it up in a moment. But there's a quote from someone from AT&T, and I think this is from the 80s or 90s, who said, "Giving a presentation without knowing your audience is like writing a love letter and starting it to whom it may concern." So I will follow up on this, as opposed to, wait, who said it? Where was that from? Etc. Because it's a delightful quote. Sarah, thank you for that. Hey, Andy, I think if I had to point one finger at one person who's responsible for this thing today, it would have to be Andy. Andy Krackov is the president of Hillcrest Advisory. And what's your take on this? I enjoyed your article a great deal. So, but rather than give you my interpretation of it, why don't you tell us what you were trying to say?
Well, I think, first of all, this is music to my ears, just hearing what everyone else says. And I appreciate, Steve, that you put together this session so that we could unpack this very concept. What comes to mind for me is often the work I do is often on local level data storytelling. It's in the health field largely. And in those instances, the audiences that people want to reach, my clients want to reach, are external. They're not an internal business organization. They are the board of supervisors, like elected officials. They're business leaders. They're the hospital. And I will hear from my clients and say, hey, can you build us a dashboard so that we can reach the board of supervisors regarding overdose safety or cardiac care? And I'll think about this disconnect. I think a dashboard for them, and what I realize is that dashboard is essentially just shorthand. It's kind of what Sarah was saying. It's shorthand for people right now. People say dashboard because that's what they're used to, especially these days when all that we know, or not all that we know, but we know dashboards from our cars, we know dashboards from COVID. So that's what we think, but they don't necessarily mean a dashboard in the way that us, who are data visualization practitioners, mean it. They just mean some way of displaying data. And so I felt like I wanted to unpack that a little bit more, partly for my own well-being, professional well-being, I guess, and partly maybe if it was helpful to others. And if you don't mind sharing my screen, Amanda, thank you. In the blog post, one of the things I want to do is talk about the other ways that we can communicate data in addition to dashboards, fact sheets, slideshows sometimes, infographics. In my mind, something that really humanizes the data, because I do think dashboards can be cold and clinical. And if you're trying to reach the board of supervisors, you sometimes need a story about an individual that can, yes, then be complemented with some data. And sometimes, thank you for sharing. I appreciate that, Amanda. Sometimes that's what we need. And I think understanding, as we are talking about right now, that that there's almost like a dashboard data story two-step, that they can work in tandem like we talked about. I think that's an important recognition for us.
Andy, some great examples there of, and I think it dovetails with what Nick has been saying, that each one of those things, someone might say that's a dashboard, and they were all wildly different things, and not managing that and understanding what are we using, what's the right way to present this information. Hey, Amanda, I do want to hear from you, but Brent, it makes me think about something for a second, which is the difference between data visualization and data storytelling. And I think I have my takeaway and interpretation of it, largely to some extent focused from reading your book. But if you were to try to in one or two sentences, and by the way, in doing this, people won't have to buy your book; they will have just gotten the two sentences.
Save a lot of people a lot of money. There we go.
Yeah, everything will be covered now. So how would you separate those two things? What's data visualization? What's data storytelling?
Well, I kind of see data visualization as a component of dashboards, a component of reports, a component of data stories, right? And so it's in my book, I talk about three key elements to every data story, and that's obviously got to have data, right? We're not just telling fictional stories here; we're basing it on facts and information, a narrative, and that's no surprise there. But that's a big part of the difference between a data story and a dashboard. That there's these narrative components. We have the story arc. We have other elements like what Andy said, where we're humanizing the data. We're creating an emotional connection with people, and there's a lot of, and actually if you go to my screen, I'll just share something from my blog post here. So that's the funnel that maybe you didn't see earlier. But down here, what I do is I go into the difference between dashboards and data stories. And so if we look at a dashboard, the focus is really about being descriptive, the what's going on within the business. And then on the data story side, it's really about the why. A dashboard on one side will be very comprehensive. It's going to look at a bunch of different things, regardless of whether there's anything interesting or different. It's comprehensive. Whereas with a data story, we're going to be very selective. And then when we get into the depth, often with a dashboard, we're covering so much territory that all we can really do is stay high level and summarize the information. Whereas on a data story, we're drilling down. We're obviously starting high level, going down. Obviously, there's the recurring nature of dashboards where there's a cadence of weekly, monthly, quarterly. Whereas when we have a data story to tell, we just tell it because it's valuable, it's urgent that we share it. Now that last one here, emotion. Again, what Andy said, it's very clinical, right? Dashboards are very clinical. But what we're trying to do with the data story is we're sharing a particular insight that hopefully will persuade people to act on it, to do something with it. And then at the bottom, this is really the connection between the two, because I view the outcome of a dashboard is really, hopefully we can generate questions that people can make observations within the data. They see something meaningful and they start to get curious and they start to question why. And that may mean depending on the dashboard, they might be able to drill in more, or they might have to go out to some other analytics tools or talk to other departments because they don't have data that may explain what's going on. But once you have done that analysis, that's when you tell a data story. You have an insight now that you want to share with people. And data visualization, we have them in dashboards, we have them in data stories. And I think, part of the reason why when I wrote my book is data visualization or data stories was being kind of used as a synonym for data visualization. And that's something I feel needed to be clarified, that yes, we have visuals within our data stories, but is it a one-to-one? No, there's so much more in a data story than just the visuals.
I have some thoughts on that, but first I'd like to hear from Amanda, and I also have the source of the quote queued up, which I'll give in a moment. Amanda, sorry to have you doing double duty, both a panelist and kind of managing the show here, but Amanda Makulec is one of my Chart Chat chums, live webinar that we do roughly once a month. She's the executive director at the Data Visualization Society and the data visualization lead at Excella, and has certainly done a huge amount of consulting and journeying and seeing different organizations. Why do you think there's so much confusion about this?
I think that one of the big challenges I see with differentiating dashboards and data storytelling and what dashboards are for, I think falls in two kind of buckets related to the expectations from clients. One thing we haven't really touched on is when I think about a dashboard, I think about something that is put into some kind of production environment to be refreshed over time. So there's some kind of data pipeline, some kind of routine data feeding that dashboard. It doesn't require all if you're manually updating all of your dashboards, then that's a pretty cumbersome role. And so dashboards to me are these monitoring tools that should be fed by these pipelines. Now that has implications for who you need on the team who's building it. You don't just need a good data viz developer, designer, and a good UI person. You also probably need data engineers or other folks who can help to build out those pipelines and think about performance. And those are things I think we don't talk about enough when we start bringing up dashboards, is it's not just the front end UI. It's all of the data pipelines and the data management and different data layer components that go into it. And building something that is meant to be put in production, refreshed over time, and managed as a data experience or exploratory tool, a data product, if you will, to me is a really different set of considerations and takes a lot more time and labor and people than when I'm building something that is going to be a series of slides where I'm summarizing a set of analysis findings and I don't have to set up structures that can scale with time, for example. And then that relates to how clients go ahead and see these products and tools, which is where I think they quickly see some of the product demos. Look how quickly you can build a dashboard with Tableau or Power BI. You can just go ahead and plug your data in and instant dashboard, instant insights. You are a data-driven company now, versus actually thinking about the ways in which those different displays get built. And back to the original question, when do we need dashboards as monitoring tools in this kind of way that are routine and surface insights? And when do we actually need someone to go through and spend time doing the analysis and bringing in the additional data sources and those qualitative insights and context? I think maybe it was Cole, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Steve, but Cole or another person in our kind of broader data viz field has talked about the fact that kind of dashboards allow you to farm for oysters, I think was the analogy, where you can go ahead and look at that. And I think think we'll probably come around to that in our conversation today, because I think that thinking about the ways in which we look for insights on dashboards instead of expecting them to answer all the questions is a really important differentiator. And I think setting these client expectations is important too. Sarah, I see you as former consulting hat on, maybe nodding in terms of how do you kind of back your clients away from having seen the shiny work of the Fleurlage twins on Tableau Public and wondering why they don't have shiny interactive Sankey diagrams on their dashboards. And working with them to set expectations on a reasonable pace of development and what the actual end product or tool can do for them and how you manage and plan for enhancements over time.
Couple of things I promised to do. One is the book I was thinking of, Say It with Charts, is by Jean Zelazny. And the quote, and this is via the Data Visualization Society back channel, the internet looked this up for us, and it comes from Ken. It's quoted in the book, but it comes from Ken Hamer, who was at the time the presentation research manager at AT&T, and it's designing a presentation without an audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern. Everyone has talked about here the dashboards being pipelines, monitoring conditions, things like that. But this data storytelling, you're trying to persuade people, you're trying to have an emotional appeal. And how do you connect these two things? Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said something, and which I just adored, which is your dashboards are boring, but with highlights. And
yeah.
And how,
I know, appealing.
Yeah, but how does this boring thing become something that may have an emotional tug or convince somebody to change their behavior or something like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of, probably dovetailing with what Amanda was saying earlier, really, I mean, there are these, I always sound like a broken record, right? But like dashboards can be very, very different things, but serve very, very different purposes. And so when I say, my design philosophy around dashboards is what I call boring with highlights, where you want kind of a very boring base layer so that you can highlight things that actually require attention. I'm talking about status monitoring dashboards specifically. And the objective there is not to persuade anybody of anything. We're not trying to move people, emotionally. It's just a very different kind of use case, right? Which is, is everything okay? And if not, what requires my attention? Really, that's what we're trying to do with status monitoring, and to answer that as quickly as possible, because of course, how often do people answer that or ask that question? Continuously, right? They never stop. And so it better be quick, right? And it is a huge challenge. It took me literally years to figure out how to design dashboards that actually accomplish that, because even a relatively junior role, in a modern organization is responsible for like vast numbers of metrics typically. And if any one of them goes wrong, they have to know about it really quickly. And again, sort of, dovetailing with what Amanda was talking about, the status monitoring challenge is very substantial, right? It is very difficult to figure out, okay, we have these mountains of data and things are changing all the time. How do we actually draw attention to the things that actually require it? And actually in my course, my dashboard course, I spend more than half the course just talking about that. And so like I said, really important. And in fact, I think when we're talking about virtually any dashboard design best practice, we have to first specify what kind of dashboard are we talking about, right? Because the kinds of dashboards that I just described, like I said, they're not going to, convince people of anything. They're not going to draw an emotional response. There's no storytelling. There are no characters, and there shouldn't be. But, in these other types of dashboards, which are maybe going to be slides in a sales presentation or something like that, and people call them dashboards, right? Because it's a bunch of charts on a single screen. Well, then our objectives are going to be very, very different. And the best practices that apply are also going to be profoundly different. And that's kind of what really brought me to this whole kind of idea of a taxonomy of dashboards, is I just saw, most of the discussions around sort of dashboard design best practices were just such a mess, because you had people who were just talking about profoundly different types of information products and then trying to agree on best practices. And it's like, no, we need to segment, right? Like we need to have these different types of dashboards. And so I gave them names, right, of the 8 different types of dashboards. Doesn't really matter. You can call them whatever you want. But I think it's super important that we recognize that there are, as designers anyways, we have to recognize that there are these very different types, and they all have profoundly different objectives and best practices. Because otherwise, any discussion of best practices is bound to just devolve into kind of a mess.
So, Sarah, I'm going to ask you a question in a moment, but and I promise to explain the oyster shucking metaphor a little bit later. But I have said, maybe somewhat controversially, I think it is fine for a dashboard to be boring. But the presentation that you curate based on that dashboard, well, that should be riveting. And Sarah, I'm wondering, you do so much brilliant work in Tableau and are also, curating, people getting good at so they can compete in Iron Viz and things like that. How much do you find that, I started with the dashboard and it helped facilitate understanding, but it metamorphosed into something quite a bit different when it went into the presentation or the deck or stuff like that? Or is it not so different in your experience?
In my experience, I think the most effective kind of applications of that have been where people have dashboards and they take elements of them and they place them maybe in monthly reports in PowerPoint or other presentation tools where they add additional context and they actually physically present them to their audience and describe what's going on. I think the type of dashboards we're talking, well, I wouldn't even call them dashboards, but the type of visualizations we're talking about when we talk about things like Iron Viz, they're completely different applications of the tool, right? I don't think that for one, we don't know who our audience is. In those cases, they're shared with the world, and they have they're very static, right? They're not going to change. It's a point in time view of a particular topic. So I think that they're two very different things.
Well,
Hey, Steve.
Yeah,
I was just
about to call on you, so thank you.
Well, I was just gonna. One thing I think that's really interesting is because we're talking about how dashboards and other formats, data stories, let's just broadly call them that, how they relate to each other, and it's really interesting for me to hear about the process working from starting with a dashboard and then working to the summary, which might be its slides. With the work I do, it's interesting because I often will go the other way, and I'm not saying there's one that's right and one that's wrong, but sometimes with the, again, more externally facing audiences that I want to reach, the initial goal is to explain the topic to somebody, is to say, hey, here's what we're talking about, here's the issue, here's what's going on, here's the problem, here are some potential solutions, here's what the data show us. And that's the data story in various formats that it could take. And then you go to the dashboard and you're in essence saying to the person, you can explore this on your own now, and it's an interactive dashboard. But if you send them there initially, they may not have the expertise to understand it, which is the purpose of starting with a data story. So it's interesting that it can work both ways.
Well, and I would even say, Andy, as we think about that, a thing that comes to mind that we've done a lot of on dashboards that has been really effective with clients is actually translating numbers, direction of change, different things into human readable sentences and words. And it doesn't take machine learning, just some calculated fields and logic to go ahead and say, like, instead of giving a readout of all the numbers, such and such a measure increased so much year over year, month over month. And I know we found that even as a starting point, moving things into more human readable text, whether it's on display on the screen or on the tooltip, actually helps people also think through what is this analysis showing me if they're not someone accustomed to reading charts and graphs, which I think is the other big assumption we make about dashboards, is that even if we've done good user research, that people know what to do with the charts once they get there.
Gee, if only there were a book that would help teach people to be comfortable with to be fluent with the language of charts and dashboards so they could make better decisions faster.
It's Brent's book, right? That's the one you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, we'll check.
Yes, it's a wonder. I didn't even ask Amanda to set something up, throw a softball so I could plug the big picture, but thank you on that.
I was going to say one thing that I think that is, maybe this might be a little bit controversial, But I think we use the term insights very loosely. And I think that we need to tighten up our usage of the difference between an observation and an insight. Because I believe in most cases, a dashboard is not providing insights. If you read any of the vendors' language out there, that, oh, you set up this dashboard, you get tons of insights into your business. And let me give you an example here. If you were looking at a dashboard and you saw that your sales went up 200% last week, is that an insight? Or is that just an observation? I would say it's just an observation. When I was writing my book, I used the term insights a lot throughout my book. And then I had a couple of reviewers come back to me and say, Brent, you need to define what insight is. And then I started to look at these definitions. I went to all the, Oxford and Cambridge and all of them. And I came away just thinking, this is not an insight for me until I came across, somebody shared with me from the author Gary Klein. He's a psychology author. And he said, what an insight is an unexpected shift in our understanding. And for me, that was my aha moment in terms of what an insight really is. So if I see sales go up 200% last week, I still don't know why. All I have is an interesting, unusual observation in the data that dashboard helped me to do. But then I'm going to have to dig into why those sales are up 200%. And when I find the why,
I would argue that
the insight.
The good dashboard helped you discover that there was something that, this observation, it helped you discover, wait a second, I would have missed that completely. This thing is now flagging it. You use one of Nick's excellent dashboards, it's going to have the little dot next to it. There'll be nothing else going on.
Exactly.
And there'll be two things with little dots, and you're immediately going to look at it and you're going to want to know what's up with that. And you would have missed that had there not been a well-designed dashboard behind.
And that's an observation. That's helping me to make observations in the dashboard.
No disagreement.
Yeah. And that is important. That is super helpful. Any anomalies in the data, any patterns, any trends that the dashboard can bring out to me. And then, whether I can do it in the dashboard and dig into what's causing that, what may explain what's going on. I think one of the comments somebody said is when she looks at her monthly dashboard, she doesn't care so much about the what, she wants to know the why behind the numbers. And I think that's where,
and Andy has written a great essay for that in the big book of dashboards, sort of the 5 whys, and but behind something which is the kind of the principle of the Toyota Corporation many years ago. Why did this happen? It takes kind of 5 levels to dig down to that. But I think we can agree that a well-designed dashboard will help you discover insights. It may not by some observation that may help you lead to the insight. And anyone want to refute what Brent has to say there? Or are we kind of, since we were trying to agree on what dashboards are in storytelling, now say, oh, well, we can't even agree what insights are. And I suspect we're in agreement. If anyone wants to chime in on that, please feel free to do so.
I think, like violent agreement. Yeah.
Well, to me, it speaks to the importance of those cross-functional conversations on teams, right? So who has the business knowledge to be able to know that you made a change in your marketing approach or your digital marketing dollar spend last month? That probably was the thing that did that. And then sometimes it gives you a clue to other data you need on the dashboard. If you realize that the story, that the reason certain metrics are changing and shifting is related to something else that's codified in quantitative data. How do we go ahead and make sure that's more accessible information? And to me, that's like the perfect way to seed and identify different enhancement opportunities for dashboards when we're thinking about dashboards as these routine monitoring tools.
Yeah, I think I would actually sort of thinking back to some of the things that Brent said as well. And I think, it's sort of a mistake that a lot of people make is they try to have that sort of status monitoring capability and the sort of explanatory diagnostic capabilities in the same dashboard. And in my experience, that just doesn't work, right? It's hard enough just to create a dashboard that just flags things that says, in the ocean of things that could need attention, right? And then if you try to layer on kind of more sort of analytical, exploratory, diagnostic capabilities, on top of that, then you end up with what I call a Swiss Army knife dashboard, right? It's a dashboard that is basically trying to do too many things. And so it doesn't do any of them particularly well. Like a Swiss Army knife, is it a good magnifying glass? It's like, no, it's crap magnifying glass. It's a crap saw, right? And so you're better off having sort of separate tools. And so, one of the things that I propose in the course that I teach, actually, maybe, Amanda, if you can switch over to my screen, I can show you basically, what I recommend to most organizations is they have sort of an ecosystem of dashboards. And so the big sort of chunk in the center there is status monitoring, because that's the hardest challenge. It's the hardest nut to crack. But then there are links, right, to other types of dashboards that can be used to sort of dig in, explore, explain. Because if we try and mash them all together, in my experience anyways, you kind of break it, right? Like I said, it's hard enough just to do the status monitoring part. And if we try and layer on other things, it just doesn't work.
So, by the way, this looking at it and systemizing it, I have mad respect for you, including something I think you published 2 days ago, which was this flow chart of when is it okay to break the value axes in a chart, not start at zero. You have a little more discipline on this than a lot of us, especially me.
That flow chart is amazing. If anyone watching this hasn't seen the flow chart, it's like talking about the access pieces and stuff. It's excellent, especially if you're kind of learning your way around how and when to break or not break rules. Just a shout out, Nick.
And well, it's not so much the rules. It's sometimes if you started at zero, you are totally obfuscating what's important. And other times, if you don't start at zero, you are being flamingly misleading, and as opposed to something very vague like, well, you don't want to be misleading, you want to be truthful. Nick is trying to systemize it. It may be a good point for me to share something from almost 5 years ago, and kind of my feeling of, well, where in all of this, in the process of connecting to data, trying to understand the data, finding an observation that leads to an insight, and then communicating that insight. Where did dashboards fit into this thing? And almost 5 years ago, I got to be a guest to attend Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflich's Storytelling with Data workshop. She was conducting one of these things in New York City, live in front of people, all in the same room. Amazing. Can't wait for more of that to be happening. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this stuff is just so great, and great way to present these things. Why is anybody going to need the book that's going to be coming out in 2 months, the big book of dashboards, the thing that I wrote with Jeff Schaefer and Andy Cockreeve? And then she discussed something, a mistake that a lot of people make in giving a presentation. When they give a presentation, they feel they need to give a background on all the hard work they did and all the data that went into it, et cetera. Essentially saying you need to shuck a lot of oysters to find a pearl. Don't feel you have to show everybody every friggin' oyster that you shucked before you find the pearl. And then a calm came over me, and I realized, oh my gosh, I know where the dashboards fit in, or one of many places. It's like an automated oyster shucker. It's going to help you get to those things that are important, nuanced, that need attention faster. And it's from there you can possibly create the curated presentation. So this thing the good dashboard can fuel the discussion, can fuel the presentations.
And I would add on to that, Steve.
I'm sorry?
I would add on to that, Steve. Not only are you enabling one person to shuck, but you're now sharing that information out with other people to shuck as well with you, right? So when you share a dashboard.
And that's the next part of this, which is, now I'm a big believer in a good curated presentation, tight presentation, key points, get the thing, emotional heartstrings, whatever it is it takes. And you think you know your audience really well, and they want to know about this thing, this market, this product, et cetera. And then someone asks you a question that's not in the deck. What about this area? Yeah, you told us about West, but I want to know about East. Being armed with the dashboard that can answer that question on the fly, and better yet, arming the audience with, oh, this has really piqued your interest, hasn't it? Beyond the 10 things or 8 things that I presented to you, you probably want to know about this other stuff. Here's this dashboard that can answer the questions that the deck or my presentation didn't. And they start to get the exploratory aspect of this and learn to find stuff that maybe the person who curated didn't. So all of this made me feel very comfortable that, yes, there's a place for this. The dashboard itself may be boring with highlights, but the curated presentation hopefully gets people excited about it. That may lead to them using the boring dashboard with highlights.
Well, and Steve, I'm going to call out that we've got some great questions coming in the live stream and the chat that people have flagged and asked about. And I mean, more than we can possibly dig into in our remaining 15 minutes. But one thing I think is really interesting is that I want to make sure we don't gloss over is around this idea of kind of who's involved in creating these different things. You talked about the role of a dashboard versus a presentation or story. And I think sometimes we create these artificial boundaries around kind of who does what part of the job. Or we expect people to be unicorns and do all the parts of the job and do them all magically well. And so I think it's a really interesting question around the different kind of skill sets and that folks need to bring to a team or the priority skills that you build. I know Dada wrote in the chat that it seems like there's a big overlap between business analyst and data viz designer. And I would extend that to UX designer if you're building interactive tools. And one of the great things I think about having a shared language and talking about those different roles and talking about actually what that actually operates and looks like is that we actually can go and look for the skill building pieces and the lexicon of information that's out there for those different areas. If I know to go look for UX best practices and boot camps or recommendations, it creates a learning path for me that otherwise I might not have as much awareness on if I'm just looking for very narrowly things on business intelligence. And I think we become better data visualization developers and a better profession in practice when we start to borrow those different tools from agile software development and from UX design and from graphic design and other spaces that can be really exciting and fun, but also really empowering for building better data products.
And Amanda, maybe one thing that who should be on the team, as a communication person myself, I might advocate for communication people on the team. And I'm hearkening back to what you had said about sentences can be an important part of data storytelling. And one of the things, like, it's really interesting to listen to this because what I'm debating is to what degree do we expect everyone to have a high level of numeracy? Because a dashboard essentially requires that. And if you are bringing on a communication person, they may be able to create the sentences that can summarize things. They may also see that, oh, well, there's a great quote here that's going to do a really nice job of filling in the blanks, or a photo, or a story about an individual, whatever it may be. So, it's not always easy, I understand, in a business setting to bring on the communication person. But I think when we can, it might benefit it. Because also, here's the other thing. The communication person is also a person that's likely going to ask, who are we trying to reach? Who's the audience? And is going to think about that audience development aspect, which is so critical.
So I will confess I am not as familiar with narrative science as maybe I should be, and maybe someone here can weigh in on it, but I think it is trying to automatically call, Brent, I'm not going to say insights, but observations from the data. So here's a chart of the data, and then here is what a human might have done to say, oh, notice that there was a big dip in sales, or up 200%, and possibly the reason behind it, which would be the insight, as opposed to, oh, there's something that needs your attention, and here's the reason behind this. I'm curious to see how much of this is the narration that might go with a particular image, or how much of it is, oh, Power BI's got something, we got to have something as well in our product. And anyone have enough familiarity with what this might bring to the table and how it may help fashion better narrative or stories around the data?
I mean, I've had a lot of people reach out to me with different startup vendors that are focusing on using natural language generation to create kind of what they call a narrative around the data that would typically go in a dashboard or whatever. And I've kind of felt like I think it's helpful. I think there's some people who respond to words and text, but essentially what we're doing is we're saying the visuals aren't working well. So let's use a bunch of words and text. And for me, that's I don't necessarily 100% agree with that. That I think you should, visuals are very quick at communicating things that maybe words kind of struggle to communicate, especially if it's just descriptive words. Again, there's a difference that I draw between explanatory words and sentences that are explaining what's going on, as opposed to, sales were increasing by 33% over the last 3 months, and then they decreased by 23% in the last week. Okay, I probably could have observed that, but it's helpful to know, the exact numbers and what's going on. But it's not, it goes back to the why. And I think it's going to take some time before those tools can really help get into the why, or even maybe they can never get into the why.
It's to make sure that we're in agreement about something. What you're not mentioning is a really useful title and some annotation layer that says, "Oh, look at this thing over here." I think we all have seen the research that suggests you want your chart to be memorable, having a memorable title that's there, not just widget dashboard, but something about here's the key finding in the title, and whatever annotation layer that's adding to this, things that you'll see done wonderfully in good magazines and periodicals, Financial Times, The Economist, etc. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that is kind of doing description of what the chart is showing you. Did everyone agree with that?
Yeah, but I want to throw out a clarifying question on the natural language thing, because I think it's a big conversation right now around natural language search and how we kind of present information in that context. And we've mentioned different tools and tech stacks that really require someone to kind of build a dashboard. You have to have a reasonable kind of baseline of skills, I think, to use Tableau or Power BI to build something effective. But then there's this other kind of class of different dashboarding tools, say like a ThoughtSpot, that are designed around the idea that I can type in a sentence and say, like, I want to see top 15 cities by blank, 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 and blank, blank, blank. And it will show me a table that I can then click and render the chart in different ways. And so it, in some ways, kind of tries to get to that point of trying to reduce the space in between the business user who has the question and where the data lives, which requires a lot more data governance and thinking about metric definitions and semantic layers and other things around making sure that's feasible and gives you a good answer. Because part of our job as data viz developers is to make sure the numbers and the metrics are right. But I'm curious on that natural language side, because I think it's a really growing question that probably merits its own whole hour or half-day conversation. But how does that play into kind of our space and what we do, and getting the business user or the kind of user closer to the data themselves, which are we working ourselves out of a job?
And that's language. That's natural language processing, right? Which is different than natural language generation. And I'll just do a quick answer because I want to hear from Nick. I would say I'm a fan of natural language processing. However, we can lower that bar, I think it's better. The more people we can get into the data and asking questions, I think that's good. I'm probably more of a skeptic on the natural language generation, but turn it over to Nick on his answer.
Yeah, kind of what Brent just said. Yeah, I would agree. I think, there's probably a lot of potential in terms of the input, like typing in queries, which is just oftentimes just saving time, right? Instead of somebody trying to remember, it's like, oh, where was that data? Where was that chart? What tab was that under? And you can just ask the question and it'll basically dig it up more quickly for them, which is fine. Although, of course, that has its own limitations as well, right? Like, I had a big argument with somebody at Tableau about this recently because I was like, there are entire classes of questions which are usually kind of why questions, explanatory questions. Why are sales down? It's like, well, the answers to that, something like that, are going to be pretty hit and miss depending on like what kind of data is actually in your system or not, whether the reason is something that can in fact be sort of deduced from the data, and sometimes it can and sometimes it can't, right? And so I think there's a lot of potential confusion amongst users in terms of what classes of questions can they actually ask and not ask. And then, of course, on the natural language generation side, as Brent said, it's like, well, if you're just kind of regurgitating what you're seeing visually, it's like, okay. And I think that though there's a lot of sort of hope and expectation that it's going to do more than that, right? It's going to sort of explain, why things are happening. And once again, I think you're running into the same problem of like, okay, maybe in certain cases you have enough data and the system is sophisticated enough to actually figure out like why are sales down, but in a lot of cases it's not. And in a lot of cases, it's going to get those kinds of answers wrong, right? And so I think that, it's good to have sort of a healthy level of skepticism around this kind of thing. Yeah.
Agree. I don't want to. I'm curious how many people here are in fact have implemented solutions and using the tool of your choice that has this as the primary front end, or even a secondary, part of the user interface, that there's a natural language interface for the stuff that you're making. Anybody here?
Not as the primary.
No.
Oh, but it is included in some of the offerings you're building?
We have used it in some instances in Power BI on more of their kind of being able to type in a question and answer it. Whether or not you get the answer you're looking for is a different question. I think that to me, the governance piece is the other elephant in the room we don't talk about enough. But again, to the things that are their own conversations of merit, there's a lot of things that rely on syntax and words and having the right fields and different things in place in the back end, that when you ask those kind of questions of your data, the words you're using match the ways in which the data is named and labeled, or you have appropriate kind of logic built in that allows for more fuzzy matching.
Yeah, and having users, actually understand all of that. There are certain terms that you can use and certain types of classes of questions. Like, I think there's a lot of landmines in that sort of, that whole space. I mean, it sounds wonderful in theory, right? Very appealing in the sales demos and whatnot. But in practicality, I see lots of potential for confusion or getting answers that sound right but actually aren't.
Yeah.
Folks, we are coming near the end of our hour. This is a lot of fun with you. I do want to, I'm going to give people an opportunity to put in their last word or last thoughts, but I do want to thank very much Amanda Makulec and the Data Visualization Society. If you are not a member, join. There's a lot of different levels of membership, including free. Thank you. You've got it, datavisualizationsociety.org. You're making a mistake not taking advantage of this wonderful organization. And in our remaining 2 minutes, any deep or even shallow thoughts that people would like to share, or something unspoken, or gee, I really wish you had asked about such and such. Nick, go ahead.
I have one. It's actually an ask. So, I have a confession. I've been kind of, sort of lurking here because I've been working on, actually, Amanda, can I just maybe share my screen? Mm-hmm. So for the last couple of months, I've been working on, as you can tell, I'm an incredible visual artist, right? But I've been working on this, right? Sort of a map of data visualization, where I'm trying to sort of sort this out in my head, right? All the things that we've been talking about in terms of the relationship between graphs and dashboards and data storytelling and diagrams, and sort of how all these things relate to one another. This has been great. I'm going to steal lots of ideas and comments that I picked up here, but I want to kind of try and open source this a little bit. And so probably in the next, realistically, it's going to be after Christmas by the time I sort of get this cleaned up enough. But then, I want to put it out there. I'll probably maybe submit it to to Nightingale, perhaps, and then, sort of gather comments. So maybe, in my efforts to systematize things, as Steve pointed out, maybe we can even try and systematize this. I know it's probably overly ambitious. And then eventually, if, we can actually come up with something that, kind of makes sense, and, there's some kind of consensus around it, then I'd love to have somebody who is actually a visual artist, who is an illustrator, to maybe make this look a lot better than my sort of, puked on a screen kind of
I can tell you,
here.
Whatever it is, we need curvy lines. Okay, you know, we need to have some curvy lines there. People
Right.
will be
Yeah.
We'll be all over it. Nick, thank you, and I'm sure you will get the help that you're seeking. Sarah, Brent, Amanda, or Andy, any parting words?
You know, I just want to pick up on what Nick just shared, and because I think this conversation has reminded me of how important it is that we get our terminology straight. Now, we're not going to lock ourselves in the box. I don't want us to do that. But to understand what dashboard means, to understand when our clients say, could you create for me an infographic? What do you mean by that? And I think if there's a way that the Data Visualization Society, be it through Nightingale or otherwise, can start to crowdsource some ideas about how we define these terms, that might be helpful, not only for us, but I think I could see turning my clients to that, to say, you tell me what you want here. So I like that.
I would just add quickly that I think we focused so much on reporting for so long, and we view things from a reporting mindset. And I talk about that in that blog that I published yesterday, where we need to shift our mindset to a different storytelling mindset, which, based on there's differences between how we focus on reporting. I mean, Amanda talked about the pipelines and all these other considerations. I don't have to focus on pipelines if I'm building a data story. I'm taking pictures. If the dashboard or reports are a CCTV camera or a security camera, they're always on, monitoring what's going on. What I'm dealing with a data story is really snapshots and putting those in an album and telling a story of our adventure that we went on for our trip. I mean, that's the difference between those two, and that's a different mindset. As Andy said, we're humanizing the data. We're creating an emotional connection, and those are different muscles, different skills. Obviously, data visualizations are at the core of both of those, but how we use them is slightly different.
Yeah, and for me, I'd like to go back to what Andy said around just really defining, helping to find what our audience mean when they say they want a dashboard, and really digging into that and really supporting, at least with the people that I work with, in terms of helping them deliver to their audience's needs and making sure they're delivering the right type of dashboard each time. So maybe giving them a framework around that. And that's something I've certainly taken away from today, and I'll be thinking about a lot more. But thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Well, and I would just echo the need for shared language and the importance of language as we're talking about different things and defining that. I think, Andy, you hit the nail on the head with, it's not just about us talking in a bubble. And I think we sometimes go down these semantic rabbit holes and ask the questions of, is it even worth having this conversation if we feel like we're talking in circles amongst ourselves? And I would argue that it is, because the more we have shared language and understanding amongst our community of professionals, the more we can radiate that out to people who we're working with to further that conversation. It makes me think back to days of working on different PEPFAR projects and hearing from folks, I heard we need an infographic. I heard I need a map, because someone somewhere said that the donor or someone else wanted one. But do you even have data that has geographic relevance? Or what do you mean by infographic? Like, do you just see numbers on a page, like the big number tiles? Is that what you mean? And that's what you want? And so I think this shared language and taking the time to understand how the people that are not ourselves outside of our domain are using these words too, and not just trying to kind of redefine what that language is really important. And we should take a kind of user-centered process in that way as we embark on that kind of initiative. Steve, Nick, I love your ambition on the word clouding that you've got going on there in terms of some kind of impact.
It's not a word cloud, it's a map.
Yes, and a map, and it needs curvy lines. Trust me, curved. If the graduate were being done now, something like that would be in there. Amanda, I just love that word radiate. And I will probably be overusing it for the next week or two. So thank you for that. So Nick, Brent, Sarah, Andy, Amanda, the Data Visualization Society, and anyone who joined us today or maybe listening after the fact, thank you so much. This has been delightful. And maybe we'll get to do it again sometime. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job, Steve.